the plants on the Bright Angel Trail and processing and eating the different plant foods. What were those? I'll get to that in a minute. The pattern of settlement for the late Archaic period, probably people were here just seasonally to take advantage of whatever plant foods were available. And this particular site was probably a processing camp related directly to those plant foods. No evidence that people were hunting at that site or that it was a permanent residence. So probably seasonal food gathering or food processing. The early Pueblo period, probably the same pattern. And it's interesting to think that the same kind of strategy for getting food was used in these extremely different cultural periods. The food gathering, and this was one of the big surprises, the late Archaic period, what they found was agave. And we had such limited evidence for that directly on this type of feature that now we have not only an abundance of evidence for agave use there, and they weren't quite able to identify the species of agave. There's three primary species that they were looking at. But some of the best evidence, and also some of the oldest evidence, this is now the oldest evidence directly that people were using and processing agave in the Grand Canyon. It was always assumed that, but we didn't have the evidence to prove it, but now we do. During the Pueblo period, they were also using agave and collecting it. So there was something about that agave plant that they were using that was very valuable to them as food. And then travel. How does this site tell us about the travel of people up and down the Grand Canyon? If you've ever been to the Grand Canyon and have done hiking, you know that travel is not an easy thing. It's by foot, and it's up and down really steep slopes. But having the Archaic period camp there and then the Pueblo camp there really says that the Bright Angel Trail was not a Ralph Cameron trail. That people were there centuries before historic Euro-American miners and explorers. That the Bright Angel Trail was used as a corridor probably by those same farmers and people that preceded them along the Colorado River to come out of the canyon and get up onto the rim. So the next time you're on the Bright Angel Trail, think about how ancient that area might be, not just in terms of geology, but in terms of the archaeology too. That's about it for the more in-depth research that we're doing, but I did want to mention several other research projects that we have going in the park, and I'd be glad to answer questions or talk further in detail with people. But the Bureau of Reclamation, the National Park Service, and Utah State University are conducting excavations, small-scale excavations along the Colorado River to mitigate, once again, the impacts of visitors and natural erosion. The Vanishing Treasures program that Jane mentioned and that I'm involved with at the park, every year we get funding to look at intact standing architecture that is fragile, and we visit sites with architecture to see what condition the architecture is in, and also to develop ways to preserve those fragile remains. The 1956 United TWA aviation accident site, that is currently a site that's being nominated to the National Historic Landmarks. And there's a researcher right here at NAU, a history student, Ben Carver, who's been working with us to complete that nomination, and he's actually writing his master's thesis on this subject. That accident site was largely responsible for the creation of the Federal Aviation Administration. It was a horrible accident, but really aviation rules and policy and safety that we know today are related back to this one unfortunate accident in the Grand Canyon. We recently completed a survey of archaeological sites in the Indian Garden area and discovered 12 new archaeological sites that hadn't been documented before. And again, the connection between the Indian Garden area and the 3 Mile Rest House really tells us that that area of the park is pretty ancient and that people use that particular area pretty extensively. Remote sensing in the park. This is using satellite imagery and ground penetrating radar to discover archaeological sites remotely, and then trying to look at the pattern of where those sites are located on the landscape and get an idea of how intensely or for how much time people were using a particular area. This is, again, partnerships and outside researchers doing work within the park. And we've worked, the one researcher has worked primarily in the Desert View area to identify Pueblo and age architectural sites. Another researcher, long-standing in the park, also in the Desert View area, to record evidence of agriculture in the Pueblo period. And then regional rock art studies that have really helped us define the different styles of rock art across the whole Grand Canyon region and how those compare to rock art in Utah and New Mexico and all over. And that is it. I'd like to leave you with a message of resource preservation. And really, you know, it's a privilege to do research. It's not a right. We see it as a way to help us understand how people may have lived in the Grand Canyon. And also, how do we best preserve those resources for the generations to come? And it's really the mission of the National Park Service to preserve all resources, natural and cultural. So the next time you're at Grand Canyon, take a minute to learn about archaeological sites and the different cultural resources that we have. Understand their sensitivity to different processes of erosion and human impacts. Get permits and ask, you know, where is it appropriate to camp, where is it not? And do your homework and help us meet that mission for preservation. And with that, thank you, and good night.